Don't forget to subscribe for more insane HOA battles. Trust me, you don't want to miss the ending of this one. The day it all began, I came home to find a piece of paper taped crookedly to my front door. At first glance, it looked like one of those cheap flyers you get about pest control or a lawn service deal. But when I pulled it off and read the bold lettering at the top, my blood pressure spiked. Violation notice, non-compliant mailbox. For a moment, I actually laughed out loud. I thought maybe it was some prank. Non-compliant? My mailbox? The same one that had stood at the edge of my driveway for years, weather-beaten but solid, painted black with a red flag and standing perfectly upright on its wooden post? Functional, definitely. Illegal? No way. But the laughter turned to a bitter taste in my mouth when I read further. According to the letter, my mailbox was in violation of aesthetic standards of the community. It actually said in print that my mailbox was unsightly and detracting from neighborhood harmony. And then I saw the fine, $150, payable within 10 days. I remember standing there in my foyer, the paper crumpling in my hand, thinking, they've finally lost it. I knew our HOA could be overzealous. I'd seen them ticket a neighbor for leaving Christmas lights up in January. I'd seen them fine a woman down the street because her trash bin was visible from the road for a few hours too long. But a mailbox? My mailbox? This was a new low. That night at dinner, I told my family. My wife nearly spit her water across the table, and my teenage son snorted so hard with laughter he almost choked. They're really coming after a mailbox now? What's next, Dad? Fines for breathing too loud. My daughter rolled her eyes but nodded. Seriously, what's wrong with it? It looks fine to me. I tried to shrug it off. Maybe this was some clerical mistake. Maybe they'd confused me with another homeowner. So I spent the evening taking pictures from every angle, front, side, top, even a close-up of the paint job. I measured the post height, the distance from the curb, even checked the USPS regulations to confirm it met federal postal guidelines. Everything was compliant. If the federal government didn't have a problem with my mailbox, why did my HOA? The next morning, I marched to the HOA office. The office was tucked inside a strip mall, a bland little space with beige walls and a smell of burnt coffee. Behind the counter sat a receptionist who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. I slapped the notice on the desk and asked to speak with whoever issued it. After a few minutes, the HOA president herself walked out, Margaret Turner. 60-something, sharp bob haircut, pearl necklace, eyes that looked like they could slice through steel. She glanced at me, glanced at the notice, and then gave me the kind of smile people reserve for unruly children. Mr. Sanders, your mailbox doesn't fit the approved design guidelines. It's as simple as that. Approved by who? I demanded. The post office says it's fine. It's sturdy, it's functional, it's black like half the mailboxes in this neighborhood. What's the issue? She gave me a long, slow blink. The issue, Mr. Sanders, is that it does not meet the community's aesthetic standards. It is, frankly, unattractive. We've had complaints. Complaints? I repeated. From who? Jim next door with the rusted, crooked tin box that looks like it came from a junkyard? Or Bill across the street whose marble monstrosity looks like a tombstone? Mine's fine compared to half the mailboxes here. Margaret's smile didn't waver. That's irrelevant. You have 10 days to replace it with an approved model, or the fines will increase. I walked out of there shaking with anger. It wasn't about the mailbox anymore. It was about control. They were testing me, trying to see if I'd roll over. Well, I wasn't going to. Over the next few days, I started digging. I pulled out the HOA's bylaws, flipping through pages of legal jargon until my eyes ached. Nowhere did it specify what mailboxes were or weren't allowed. The only vague line I found was about maintaining aesthetic harmony in public view. That could mean anything. If they could fine me for a mailbox, they could fine me for the color of my curtains if someone saw them through a window. I decided I wasn't paying. I wrote the letter back, citing USPS regulations, noting the lack of specifics in the bylaws, and demanding proof of the so-called complaints. Days went by without a response. Then came another notice, this time with the fine doubled to $300. That's when I realized this wasn't going to be a simple fight. Margaret and her board weren't interested in fairness or logic. This was about power. And if I didn't push back, they'd keep squeezing. Late one evening, I sat on my porch, staring at that ugly black mailbox in the fading sunlight. Neighbors walked past, some giving me sympathetic looks, others avoiding eye contact. And that's when something clicked. If this was happening to me, it had probably happened to others. Maybe smaller things, maybe things they just paid to avoid the hassle. But if no one fought back, the HOA would keep tightening the leash. I pulled out my phone and started calling around. By midnight, I'd spoken to 3 different neighbors who all had their own horror stories. Petty fines, ridiculous violations, threats of liens. Margaret had a reputation for ruling with an iron fist, and most people were too afraid to challenge her. But I wasn't afraid. Not anymore. I decided then and there, I was going to fight this. Not just for my mailbox, but for everyone in this neighborhood. I didn't know it yet, but this ugly little battle over an ugly mailbox was about to spiral into a war that would shake the entire HOA to its core. By the time the second violation notice landed in my mailbox, ironic, isn't it? I already had a plan forming. But the bold black letters across the top still made my stomach churn. $300 fine. Immediate action required. I crumpled it in my fist and tossed it onto the kitchen table. My wife raised her eyebrows. They doubled it already? Yeah, I muttered, pacing the kitchen. They think I'm going to fold. They think I'll just write them a check so they'll leave me alone. She crossed her arms. Well, are you? I stopped pacing and shook my head. No, this isn't about the money anymore. It's about them thinking they can bully everyone. The truth was, I couldn't stop thinking about the conversations I'd had with my neighbors. Jim had been fined for having too many potted plants on his porch. Sarah down the street had been threatened with legal action when her teenage son parked his pickup truck in front of their house for 3 nights in a row. Another guy had been fined nearly $500 because his American flag was too large. These weren't isolated cases, they were a pattern. And Margaret Turner, our iron-fisted HOA president, was at the center of it all. That night, I set up a group chat with the neighbors who'd complained. Then I printed flyers and went door to door, talking to anyone willing to listen. At first, people were hesitant. They'd lower their voices, glance over their shoulders, and whisper about how the HOA always found out if you made waves. But when I told them about my so-called ugly mailbox fine, most people laughed, and then they got angry. Within a week, I had a small but determined group of neighbors ready to stand up. We called ourselves the Coalition. Not very original, but it felt powerful. Our first meeting was in my garage. Folding chairs lined up in a half circle, a cooler of sodas in the corner, and everyone holding copies of their violation notices. As people spoke, the stories piled up, more absurd, more outrageous, more infuriating than the last. By the end, the air was thick with frustration and determination. Margaret acts like she owns this neighborhood, Sarah said, her voice trembling with anger. But she doesn't. We do. We should take her to court, another neighbor chimed in. I shook my head. That's the nuclear option. Court cases take forever, and they'll drain us dry with legal fees. No, we fight this smart. We expose them. We gather evidence. We show the community just how ridiculous and abusive these fines are. If enough people rally with us, the board won't be able to ignore it. Everyone nodded. For the first time, I saw hope in their eyes. But Margaret wasn't about to back down quietly. A few days later, I came home to find a third notice in my mailbox. This one wasn't just a fine, it was a threat. If I didn't pay the $300 and replace my mailbox within 10 days, the HOA would place a lien on my home. A lien. Over a mailbox. My wife gasped when she read it. Can they even do that? They can try, I said grimly. But I'm not giving in. That night, I stayed up late at my laptop, digging deeper into HOA law. I learned that while HOAs had broad powers, they weren't limitless. If they couldn't prove that my mailbox violated a written, specific rule in the bylaws, they had no case. And nowhere did it say what kind of mailbox we had to have. Still, they were banking on fear. Most people would rather pay up than risk losing their home. That's how they kept control. I decided to hit back. The next day, I sent a certified letter to the HOA demanding they provide written documentation of the specific rule I had violated. I gave them 10 days to respond, warning that failure to do so would be considered harassment. I copied the letter to a local attorney just to make it official. Then I took it a step further. I went public. I posted photos of my ugly mailbox on our neighborhood Facebook group alongside a copy of the violation notice. My caption was simple: "Does this look like a $300 fine to you? HOA says it's ugly. What do you think?" Within hours, the post blew up. Comments flooded in, some angry, some sarcastic, many sharing their own horror stories. People were furious. "My God, they fined you for that? Looks better than mine. Margaret's gone off the rails." The next morning, I got a call. "Mr. Sanders," Margaret's clipped voice said through the receiver, "I need you to remove that Facebook post immediately. You are spreading misinformation." Misinformation? I shot back. "I posted the exact notice you sent me. If that's misinformation, then you're the one who wrote it." Her voice grew icy. "If you don't comply, there will be consequences." "Margaret," I said calmly, "the only consequence here is that you've picked a fight with the wrong homeowner." And I hung up. By then, the story had spread beyond just our neighborhood. A local journalist reached out, asking if I'd be willing to talk about the situation for a piece on HOA abuse of power. I agreed. When the article hit the local paper, the headline read, "Homeowners clash with HOA over ugly mailbox fine." My picture, standing proudly next to my black mailbox, was splashed right at the top. Margaret must have been livid, because 2 days later, the HOA called an emergency board meeting. Flyers went out to every household. Community meeting, urgent matters to discuss. I knew this was it. Margaret wanted to make an example out of me. The night of the meeting, the clubhouse parking lot was packed. Neighbors streamed in, muttering under their breath, holding their own violation notices like evidence in a courtroom. When Margaret took the podium, her smile was tight, her voice dripping with condescension. "Thank you all for coming. It has come to our attention that certain residents have been spreading misinformation and creating unnecessary hostility in our community. We are here tonight to set the record straight." I sat near the front, my arms crossed. My heart was pounding, but I was ready. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about everyone. When Margaret began waving a copy of my violation notice and calling my behavior disruptive, I stood up. My voice shook at first, but I forced it to steady. "Disruptive? Margaret, you fine me $300 because you don't like the way my mailbox looks. And I'm not the only one. Look around." Dozens of neighbors held up their own notices. Gasps rippled through the room. Margaret froze, her smile faltering for the first time. "This isn't about rules," I said, louder now. "This is about control. And we're done being controlled." The room erupted in applause. For the first time, I saw fear flicker in Margaret's eyes. And in that moment, I knew the war had just begun. The days after that explosive meeting felt like walking on a battlefield where the smoke hadn't cleared yet. The HOA board had been rattled, Margaret most of all. But rattled didn't mean defeated. If anything, I knew she was more dangerous now. The morning after, I found a fresh letter taped to my front door in big, bold type. "Final warning. Non-compliance will result in legal action." I laughed bitterly. Legal action over a mailbox? But as I read further, my stomach knotted. The letter claimed that I was in violation not only for the mailbox, but also for unauthorized gatherings at my property. That was their new tactic. They were coming after the neighborhood meetings I'd been hosting in my garage. When I showed the letter to my wife, she shook her head. "They're desperate. They're making things up now." "Yeah," I said, pacing. "But if they file paperwork in court, even if it's bogus, it could still drag us into a legal mess." That night, I gathered the coalition again. The garage was packed, more neighbors than ever. People were angry but also scared. The threats were working. "They can't scare us into silence," Sarah said firmly, standing up. "That's what they want. But if we back down now, we lose." "Exactly," I said. "And we're not going to lose. We're going to push back harder." But how? That was the real question. It was Jim, our quietest neighbor, the one who rarely spoke up, who broke the silence. What if we documented everything? Every notice, every ridiculous fine, every time Margaret or one of the board members harassed us. We compile it all, and then we go to the city. Heads turned. The idea hung in the air. You mean, take it outside the HOA? I asked. He nodded. Exactly. The city council. The mayor. Even the state HOA regulatory board. These associations are supposed to serve homeowners, not torment them. I leaned back, considering it. It was risky, but it also made sense. If we could show a pattern of abuse, maybe someone with real authority would intervene. We agreed that night. Everyone would dig up old letters, fines, emails, anything. We'd build a file so thick the board couldn't ignore it. In the meantime, though, Margaret wasn't slowing down. 2 days later, she filed a violation against me for overgrown lawn edges. The kicker? My lawn was perfectly trimmed. I had literally mowed it the day before. It was laughable, but it was also infuriating. I decided to fight fire with fire. I walked outside, snapped photos of my yard from every angle, and then posted them in the neighborhood Facebook group right next to the violation notice. Does this look overgrown to you? The comments poured in again. People were furious on my behalf. Some even posted their own lawns for comparison, daring the HOA to fine them too. The story was snowballing, and Margaret was losing control of the narrative. But then things got darker. One evening, as I pulled into my driveway, I noticed a car parked across the street with its lights off. I didn't recognize it. When I got out of my truck, the car started and drove slowly away. The next night, the same thing happened. Different car, same behavior. I couldn't prove it, but I had a feeling Margaret had people watching me. I told my wife and she got pale. This is getting dangerous, she whispered. What if they try something? They won't, I said, trying to sound confident. Not if we stay ahead of them. But inside, I wasn't so sure. Then one morning it happened. A sheriff's deputy showed up at my door, official papers in hand. You've been served, he said flatly. I took the envelope, my hands trembling. Inside was a formal lawsuit from the HOA, failure to comply with architectural standards, disruption of community peace, and slander against the board. Slander. They were suing me for telling the truth. I felt my chest tighten. They're actually trying to drag me into court. The deputy gave a sympathetic shrug. Good luck, he muttered and left. I sat down at the kitchen table, staring at the papers. My wife looked at me with wide eyes. What do we do now? I took a deep breath. We fight back. Harder than ever. The coalition rallied around me. People were furious when they heard about the lawsuit. They can't do this, Sarah said, slamming her fist on my table. They're abusing the system. They can do it, I said grimly. But so can we. I called the local journalist who'd written the first article about the mailbox. When I told her about the lawsuit, she nearly gasped. You're kidding. They're suing you for slander? That's a story in itself. Within days, the paper ran a follow-up article, HOA sues homeowner over mailbox dispute. It painted the board in exactly the light they didn't want, vindictive, abusive, out of control. And it didn't stop there. A local TV station picked it up next. Soon, I was standing on my front lawn, giving interviews in front of cameras. My mailbox had become a symbol of HOA abuse, and people from other neighborhoods were reaching out with their own stories. But while the media attention was growing, so was the pressure. The HOA doubled down, sending me daily notices for new, made-up violations. Trash cans visible for 10 minutes too long. A garden hose left coiled, improperly. Even a wind chime that was too loud. They were trying to break me. One night, as I sat in the garage with my neighbors, I felt the weight of it pressing down. The lawsuit, the harassment, the constant stress. For a moment, I wondered if Margaret was winning. But then I looked around the garage. Dozens of my neighbors sat with me, tired but determined. They weren't just fighting for me, they were fighting for themselves. I stood up. They think this is about a mailbox. But it's not. It's about control. It's about power. And we're not going to let them take that from us. Applause filled the garage. The coalition was stronger than ever. Still, I knew the next battle would be the hardest yet, standing up to Margaret and her board in court. And as much as I hated to admit it, I wasn't sure how it would end. But one thing was certain, whatever happened, I wasn't backing down. The courthouse loomed ahead of me like a stone fortress. My wife squeezed my hand as we walked up the steps. My stomach was tight, my palms damp. I'd been in confrontations before, neighborhood spats, tense HOA meetings, even heated exchanges on my front lawn, but this was different. This was war, and the battlefield was a courtroom. Inside, the board sat together at one table, their attorney in a crisp gray suit flipping through folders. Margaret was perched at the center, smug as ever, her eyes locked on me like a hawk watching prey. I could practically hear her thoughts. We've got him now. Our side looked less intimidating. Just me, my wife, Sarah, and a lawyer I'd hired with the money neighbors had chipped in to help. His name was Daniel, a younger attorney with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue. He leaned over to me and whispered, "Relax. They've overplayed their hand. This is exactly what I was hoping for." When the judge entered, the room fell silent. Papers rustled, chairs squeaked, and suddenly it was real. The HOA attorney wasted no time. "Your Honor," he began smoothly, "this homeowner has repeatedly violated community standards, defamed the board with malicious falsehoods, and incited disorder among residents. This is not about a single mailbox. It is about his pattern of defiance and slander against a legally elected authority." He spoke for nearly 20 minutes, painting me as some kind of neighborhood anarchist. By the time he finished, Margaret was beaming like she'd already won. Then Daniel stood. He didn't even look at the notes in front of him. "Your Honor, let's be clear. This is a lawsuit about a mailbox. A mailbox that is perfectly functional, perfectly safe, and perfectly in compliance with city standards. The HO doesn't like how it looks. That's it. And instead of addressing this issue reasonably, they've engaged in harassment, intimidation, and now, legal bullying." Margaret bristled. Daniel continued, "We will show that this board has targeted my client unfairly, issued frivolous violations, and abused its power. And we will show that this so-called slander claim is nothing more than an attempt to silence a homeowner who dared to speak the truth." The judge nodded slowly. "Proceed." The case unfolded like a chess match. The HOA attorney brought out photos of my mailbox, blown up on a projector screen as if it were a crime scene exhibit. "Unsightly. Out of harmony with the neighborhood," he intoned. Daniel countered by pulling out photos of 10 other mailboxes in the neighborhood, all different shapes, sizes, and colors. "So, Your Honor, what is the definition of ugly? Because apparently it changes depending on who the board dislikes." There were chuckles from the gallery. Even the judge cracked a smile. Next came the violations. The HOA presented a thick stack of papers, each one citing me for some alleged infraction. Daniel calmly laid out my photos and evidence disproving them, one by one. By the time he was done, their case was looking less like law and more like harassment. But the real turning point came when Daniel called Sarah to the stand. "Ms. Johnson, can you tell the court what you've observed about the HOA's actions toward my client?" Sarah's voice was steady, but her words cut deep. She described the sudden flood of violations, the intimidation, the car that had been parked outside my house at night. She even produced a screenshot of a text Margaret had accidentally sent to the wrong group chat, one that read, "We'll make his life so miserable he'll move on his own." The courtroom gasped. Margaret's face went pale. Daniel seized the moment. Harassment. Retaliation. Abuse of authority. That is what this case is really about. By the end of the day, the HOA's attorney looked rattled. Margaret was fuming, whispering furiously at him as if sheer anger could rewrite the facts. When the judge finally called for recess, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. But the battle wasn't over. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. Microphones shoved in my face, cameras flashing. "Why is the HOA targeting you? Do you really think this is about more than a mailbox? What message do you have for other homeowners dealing with abusive HOAs?" I held up my hands. "This isn't just about me," I said firmly. It's about every homeowner who's been bullied by people who were supposed to serve them. We're standing up because enough is enough. The crowd cheered. Neighbors had shown up too, waving homemade signs. Justice for homeowners. End HOA abuse. It's just a mailbox. It felt less like a lawsuit and more like a movement. But behind the cheers, I knew Margaret wasn't finished. People like her didn't back down. They doubled down. That night, sure enough, a new violation was taped to my door. Improper political activity on premises. They were now fining me for speaking to the press. I tore it down, crumpled it, and tossed it in the trash. They're scared, I told my wife. And when people like Margaret are scared, they make mistakes. Still, the stress was getting heavier. My nights were restless. I'd wake up at 3 a.m. and stare at the ceiling, wondering if we'd really win. Wondering if the board could bankrupt me with legal fees before justice caught up. The coalition was my anchor. Neighbors kept showing up, bringing coffee, offering encouragement, even slipping envelopes of cash to help with the lawyer bills. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for all of them. One night as we sat in the garage, Sarah leaned in. What if we go bigger? What do you mean? I asked. Public records. These boards have to file their budgets and expenditures. What if we dig through their books? If they're shady enough to pull this, maybe they're shady with the money too. A spark lit in me. If we find financial misconduct. They're finished, she said. The room buzzed with excitement. Suddenly, we had a new plan. The lawsuit might have been their move, but we were about to flip the board over entirely. As I shut the garage door that night, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks: hope. The battle was raging, but the tide was starting to turn. Margaret thought she could silence me with lawsuits and fines. But she'd just made the biggest mistake of all. She'd given me a reason to dig deeper. And I was about to uncover something she never wanted anyone to see. The next morning, I sat at my kitchen table with a mug of strong coffee and a stack of printouts Sarah had pulled from the county clerk's office. The HOA's budgets, expenditures, and annual filings, all public records, all there for anyone willing to dig. I spread them out like puzzle pieces. This doesn't make sense, I muttered, running my finger down a column of numbers. Look here, $15,000 landscaping maintenance in 1 quarter. But I know for a fact the contractor only mowed the common areas once a week, and the rate is about 1/3 of this. Sarah leaned over. And here, what's this consulting fee? $8,200 paid to Redfield Enterprises. Who even is that? Daniel, our lawyer, joined us that evening for what we half-jokingly called our war council. He scanned the sheets and raised an eyebrow. Redfield Enterprises? I've seen that name before. He pulled out his laptop, tapped a few keys, and turned the screen toward us. Redfield Enterprises is owned by a man named Robert Redfield. Guess who his sister is? My stomach dropped. Don't tell me. He smirked. Margaret. It was a smoking gun. They were funneling HOA money into Margaret's family business. That's not just shady, Daniel said. That's fraud. If we prove this, it's not just a civil matter. It could be criminal. The coalition gathered in my garage that night, the air electric with energy. Neighbors pored over spreadsheets, whispering in disbelief. One of them, an accountant, nearly choked on his coffee. This is blatant embezzlement. They're cooking the books and hoping no one notices. I stood up. They wanted a war over a mailbox? Fine. Let's give them one. We take this to the homeowners first. Then, if they won't listen, we take it to the state attorney's office. The room erupted in cheers. 2 days later, we packed the community center for an emergency homeowner meeting. Word had spread fast. People who'd never shown up to HOA meetings before were cramming into chairs, standing along the walls, even spilling out into the hallway. Margaret and the board looked rattled. They hadn't called this meeting, we had. And for once, they weren't in control. I stepped up to the microphone. My voice shook at first, but the energy of the crowd carried me. Neighbors, for months this board has told you I was the problem, that my mailbox was the issue, that I was stirring up trouble. But the truth is, they've been hiding something from all of us. I held up a copy of the budget. Do you know where your HOA dues are going? They're not just paying for landscaping and maintenance. They're being funneled into companies connected to the board president's family. Tens of thousands of dollars. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone shouted, "Thieves!" Another yelled, "I knew it." Margaret shot to her feet. This is slander. Outrageous lies. But Daniel stood and coolly set the records on the table in front of the homeowners. Not lies. Public documents. Black and white. You can all see for yourselves. The room buzzed with anger. Years of frustration were boiling over. People began shouting questions at the board, demanding answers, demanding resignations. Margaret tried to bang a gavel, but no one listened. The control she once held with an iron grip was slipping through her fingers. Then one voice cut through the noise, "Vote them out." The chant spread like wildfire. Vote them out. Vote them out. I could see it in Margaret's eyes, the panic, the disbelief that her kingdom was crumbling in front of her. She stormed out, her board members scrambling after her. The meeting dissolved into chaos, but the tide had turned. We weren't just resisting anymore, we were winning. That night, my phone buzzed nonstop. Neighbors thanking me, pledging support, offering to help. Someone even started a petition to recall the entire board. But Margaret wasn't done. The very next morning, a letter appeared in my mailbox. No return address. No signature. Just a typed note that read, "Stop this now or you'll regret it." I stared at it, my hands trembling. For the first time, fear crept in. This wasn't just about fines or lawsuits anymore. This was personal. Sarah read the note and clenched her jaw. She's desperate. That means we're close to breaking her. I wanted to believe her, but that night, as I lay in bed listening to every creak of the house, every rustle outside, I couldn't shake the unease. Was Margaret unhinged enough to go further? The coalition urged me not to back down. If you stop now, they win, Daniel reminded me. But if you keep pushing, we'll not only clear your name, we'll take down a corrupt board. So I pushed. We compiled everything, the fraudulent payments, the inflated landscaping contracts, the family kickbacks. Daniel drafted a formal complaint and submitted it to the state attorney's office. Within a week, investigators were asking questions. And that's when it happened. Late one evening, as I was walking back from the garage, headlights swept across my driveway. A black SUV idled at the curb. The window rolled down just enough for me to see Margaret's cold glare. Then the car sped off into the night. It wasn't illegal, but it was a message. I knew then, the final battle was coming. Margaret wasn't going to go quietly, and I wasn't going to back down. This had started with a so-called ugly mailbox. But now it was about something much bigger: power, corruption, and justice. And the showdown was about to begin. The day of the final city council vote arrived, and the tension was thicker than the summer heat. Our case had been all over the local news by now, and people from across the city had gathered in the council chambers. Some were homeowners who had been fined by their HOAs for the same reason. Others were simply curious onlookers who wanted to see if a small group of residents could actually take down an organization as entrenched as a homeowners association. When my name was called to speak, my legs trembled a little, but my voice was steady. I walked to the podium, held up the HOA's violation letter, and let the red violation notice stamp speak for itself. The chamber was silent as I spoke. I stand here not just for my family, but for every resident who has been bullied by rules that serve no purpose other than vanity. The city told us to conserve water. We followed those orders. And for doing the right thing, we were punished. If the HOA can override city law, then where does it end? How can any of us feel safe in our own homes if we can be fined for following the law of the land? I glanced at the council members. Some nodded. A few scribbled notes. I pressed on. This isn't about lawns. This isn't about property values. This is about control. The HOA thinks they can dictate every aspect of our lives. But our homes are not theirs to rule. Our water is not theirs to waste. And our families should never be forced to choose between following the law and obeying an HOA rule. When I finished, the crowd erupted in applause. The HOA president, who was sitting a few rows back in his sharp black suit, folded his arms and looked away. For once, he didn't have the smug grin he always wore during board meetings. The council's decision was swift. They voted unanimously to pass an ordinance forbidding any HOA in the city from penalizing homeowners for following state or city conservation mandates. The mayor himself signed it into law within the hour. We had won. But the story didn't end there. Word of the new law spread quickly, reaching nearby towns and even state lawmakers. Advocacy groups contacted me, asking if I'd be willing to share our story as an example of HOA overreach. Before I knew it, I was standing in front of a television camera, telling the same story I had told to the council, but now to an audience of thousands. The HOA tried to spin the outcome as if they had supported conservation all along, but no one bought it. Their credibility was shattered, and several board members quietly resigned within months. Neighbors who had once been too afraid to speak against them began sharing their own experiences: fines for flower colors, warnings about garden gnomes, even a family told to repaint their door because it was not harmonious with the community. It was as if our victory had unlocked everyone's voice. The fear of retaliation was gone. The HOA had been exposed as a paper tiger. One evening, weeks after the vote, I sat on my porch watching the sun dip below the horizon. My lawn was still brown, but it was healthy, alive beneath the surface, just waiting for rain to revive it. I thought about everything we had been through, the fines, the late fees, the threats, the stress, and I realized it had all been worth it. My kids came outside with glasses of iced tea, and my spouse sat beside me. "You realize," they said with a smile, "you've probably changed things for thousands of people." I chuckled. I just wanted to stop a ridiculous fine. "Sometimes," they replied, "the smallest battles spark the biggest change." The next HOA meeting was awkward, to say the least. I didn't go in with anger this time, but with quiet confidence. The board sat in silence, unable to argue, unable to fine, unable to control. They had lost the power they once wielded like a weapon. As I left the room, a few neighbors stopped me to shake my hand. One older gentleman whispered, "You gave us our voices back." That night, as I lay in bed, I realized the truth. This wasn't just a personal victory. It was proof that when you stand up against injustice, even something as small as a lawn fine, you can change the rules for everyone. The HOA had tried to make me an example. Instead, I made them one. And that's how a $250 fine turned into a citywide law, a new story, and a reminder that homeowners have power when they refuse to stay silent. Because sometimes, the ugliest lawns grow the strongest roots.